truth. Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back, folks. This is Patrick Henningsen. We're in hour number 2 of this live broadcast. Appreciate you coming along for the ride on Friday. It's been an action-packed and powerful week of broadcasting. We've had some great segments. Of course, Peter Ford in the first hour. That was an amazing conversation, and I learned a lot, certainly, about the roots of one of the key problems there regarding Gaza and what Israel is trying to do to the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, namely destroy it with the help of the United States, replace it with who knows what, maybe nothing, tells you what plans they have for Gaza in the future. We're going to pivot back over to Europe and specifically to Russia. I want to bring on to the program international human rights lawyer and also journalist and author of Foreign Entanglements, Arnaud Develay is joining us right now on the live link. Appreciate you coming on board this evening in Moscow, your time, Arnaud. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, Patrick, for having me. Always a pleasure.
So, one of the big stories this week, and I really want to get your thoughts on this. Something happened earlier in the week. A major, I think, one of the most popular U.S. pundits in terms of especially the war in Ukraine as it's unfolded, former UN weapons inspector, former Marine Corps intelligence officer Scott Ritter attempted to board a flight in Washington, D.C., heading for, I think, Russia to the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. He was slated as a panel speaker, obviously very popular internationally. His take on everything in the last couple of years has been, he's one of the biggest, sort of most viewed figures. His passport was confiscated. U.S. agents boarded the plane, took him off the plane, took away his passport, took his luggage off the plane, and that was the end of that. I mean, this is an incredible situation. No statements made or nothing. I'm still waiting to hear more on this from Scott. But what was your reaction and, on that, Arnaud? What do you know on this situation?
Well, to be sure, not much more than what you just related. Save for a couple of rectification, he actually was slated to depart from JFK, and he was not intercepted on board, but as he was about to step into the cabin. So as you might recall, when you take a plane, you go through a series of filters, the last one of which being, as you ready yourself to enter the cabin, you have to slide your ticket, your boarding pass into your passport, and then proceed into the cabin. When that happened, just as he was about to get through the final filter, 3 burly, all Robocop geared-like individuals presented themselves, identified themselves from what I understand, at least bearing on the fact that they were acting at the behest of the State Department, and demanded, first of all, Scott identify himself, confirm his identity, which he did, after which time they proceeded to request that he hands over his passport. And basically they accompanied him back to the where you pick up your luggage, and that was it, and he was let to go. I saw his segment on Judge Napolitano, and he basically, the judge was obviously thinking loyally and said, did you get the chance to get those guys' numbers, IDs, and or get a receipt, And Scott was just saying, well, I'm mentally speaking, already kind of like into the gig of, speaking at the SPIF 2024. And all those things happened kind of quickly. And no, I didn't get, I didn't have the same, the good reflexes of asking them who they were, at the behest of whom were they acting. Actually, he did ask him that, and they said, we don't know. Well, we don't know. So, but we all know that this comes from the top, right? I.e. Anthony Blinken, obviously. Now, there's also an element that bears on a prior conviction, which should have been somehow the object of a diligence on his part prior to leaving the country. And this would have expressed itself through a markings of some sorts inside the passport. Obviously, he did not do it for the simple reason that he was allowed to travel not once but twice outside the country without landing himself through this process. So I would assume this was a technicality that State Department latched on at the last minute to trying to prevent him from going there and do what he's been doing best, the last 2 years. I would say the last 22 years to be sure, but the last 2 years, which is public diplomacy. And he said so himself, in saying that, we are really teetering on the edge of the abyss here, which what's going on in the what looks increasingly to be not just a NATO proxy war, but a direct NATO intervention in Ukraine. And what was the several statements made by senior Western officials bearing on allowing Ukraine to use those long-range missiles deep into Russian territory proper. So I guess that was too much for Blinken and the gang, and so they decided to act as they usually do in a kind of a petty manner. Why petty? Because in the end, Scott was able to do what he does best, and although he was not there in person, as you mentioned in your intro, he participated in the panel in which he was invited to participate. So, but this is par for the course now as far as what goes on in the States. You might have heard about people getting canceled out from the media landscape the last few days. It seems to be accelerating. So there's definitely what's something that I would qualify as akin to a military censorship, as if you were readying to make sure that whatever it is you're cooking is not somehow related or relayed by people who have no qualms about talking about certain things. And so that's not a good sign. It's really not a good sign, to be sure. And to the extent there were at least, what I understand, 2 Americans, Scott Bennett and Larry Johnson, present there.
Yeah,
It'll be interesting to
Jackson Hinkle, the big Twitter influencer. He came.
Indeed.
So why didn't they pull those guys off the plane, and they pulled Scott off the plane? That's the part I don't understand.
Well, I think it comes back to that technicality. I think they could not consciously proceed in doing so with the individuals that you mentioned, because they did not have anything remotely admissible, on a procedural level to do that. Now, even in the case of Scott, there are still a lot of questions here. I mean, what one needs to understand is that in the wake of 9/11, the national security state pretty much did away with constitutional provision, especially at point of entries in continental United States. Especially, there's what's called the 100-mile rule. It's kind of a rubber alongside the continental border, in which technically you have no constitutional right. You could be coming from Canada in a vehicle 100 miles into the U.S. territory. You could be pulled over, and there won't be any kind of explanation required as to why they decide to search your trunk, for instance. So that's a lot of things. This is an important thing that a lot of people seem to have overlooked, is that we live in a post-9/11 world. And so those constitutional provisions, to the extent they apply to the Fourth Amendment, this is gone. Now, we're still left with the First Amendment. Obviously, his act of flying out to Russia to talk at a forum falls squarely into the First Amendment. So there could be a case for that. There's also the violation of the Fifth Amendment. One could make the case that it's a hearing and due process violation. But this still remains to be seen. I'm not quite 100% sure. On the face of it, it would seem as if we have a prima facie Fifth Amendment violation. But I would not bank, the whole thing on it, because they could be saying that you were aware of certain regulations bearing on your prior, and so no one is supposed to be ignorant of the law. To the extent you were planning on leaving the country, you should have, integrated that you had to do X, Y, and Z before boarding any kind of plane. So,
Well,
we'll see what the government says.
It's our understanding he's not under probation orders or anything like that. I think he's done his time and so forth years ago. I don't know if that's how long that's effective on his record, but he's not on probation or anything. So the only problem he might run into is if another country might refuse entry based on a criminal record in the United States, which is common, actually. And so I know even Mike Tyson had that issue when he was heavyweight champion. He couldn't travel to some countries because of his assault charges at the time. So that prevented him from, fighting and some other, defending his title and so forth. But here, the irony of this is unbelievable, Arnaud, because during the Soviet times, those people who they did not allow to leave the country, who were against the government, they called them refuseniks, and they withdrew their ability to. So he's going to Russia. He's being treated like a refusenik under the Stalin regime. I mean, to me, that's the irony I see in this, Arnaud, which I think somehow this is lost on quite a few people, but it's kind of like, it really exemplifies the situation in a way that you can't even possibly explain it.
Yes, although there's a major difference between the two situations. I mean, back in the days, if you were indeed a refusenik, that was it. I mean, whatever message you wanted to convey to the West, it had to go through some kind of convoluted process. They used to have what's called those, I forgot the name of it. It's a typical, those fanzines under the coat.
Oh, Samistat.
Yeah, that's right. Samistat.
Yeah.
So it required a lot of inventiveness, to get those materials out of the country. Actually, there was a movie made about this called "The Life of Others," dealing with the Stasi East German.
That's an amazing film.
Thing.
Yeah,
really recommend it. But here, actually, it backfired because, like I say, I mean, unless they went to his place and confiscated all the equipment and communication tools, he was able to make a broadcast. Hell, even had they done that, he could have gone to a friend's house, connected himself, and so this really actually backfired on the State Department, if you ask me, and really, to the extent it's also it is an informational war, it is an hybrid warfare, but it's also first and foremost this idea that as far as the U.S. government is concerned, they are the repository of all those rights that they talk about all the time. And having something like this happen to someone who worked for the U.S. government, who has a long-standing track record of calling out the U.S. government when the latter steps out of line, especially in as far as issues of war and peace, and kind of like coming at him, like after all those years, it looks terrible. It's just,
his street
doesn't
cred
really matter.
They've just given him like a promotion in terms of street credibility. I mean, you can't buy this type of street cred to have the U.S. prevent you from traveling to speak in an event. I mean, this is like Scott Ritter's credentials are now ironclad as a dissident right now. But not only that, just credible because it really what it infers is that there's something that he's saying that Washington doesn't want said or doesn't want said to a global audience. But as you say, Arnaud, it's kind of ridiculous in this day and age because he was given a pretty nice platform. I mean, the presentation of his remote call was first class. They had clearly had him in the studio with a big leather chair, and he was able to sort of do what he does best, which is deliver really impactful commentary. I've got a couple of segments of this. This is from the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. This was just last night, so we able to get a couple of clips from their live stream, which broadcast globally on this. This is part one clip. This is the first clip. It's a shorter clip, and Scott addresses this actually addresses this issue, which I found to be extremely poignant and quite powerful in how he delivered this. Let's go ahead and watch this.
You're dealing with perception versus reality is what we're talking about here. And we have a situation where the United States government, the European governments, and indeed their co-conspirators in the Western mass media are tasked with shaping a perception that Russia is an enemy. And they use this perception to gather their resources, both economically, diplomatically, militarily. But it's essential that they stay on track. Russia must be configured as an enemy worthy of confrontation, worthy of the allocation of these resources. And then there's the reality of Russia. And the reality is something that the West cannot allow to emerge. And so we're in a battle between perception and reality. And anybody who has the audacity to try and correct the record, so to speak, to reach into Russia, to capture the Russian experience and to bring it out and try to expose it to a Western audience is deemed as an enemy of the state, literally. I think many of the people on your panel on the stage with you understand what I'm talking about. And I think the fact that I'm not there with you today highlights the reality of what I'm talking about. People who seek to speak the truth about Russia, to educate a Western audience about Russia, to demonstrate that Russia is not a threat worthy of the actions of the United States, Europe, NATO, etc., are attacked. They're smeared. Their voices are sought to be silenced. So, this is, again, comes down to perception versus reality. And the perception's going to win if you're not able to put an alternative point of view out there. And so it's a constant struggle that we're all engaged in.
So, as you said, Arnaud, they pretty much proved his point. I mean, what he said, it's that this is just insane, actually, watching this unfold and him having to go remote and address the very situation that what's happened to him totally proves the main topic, one of the main topics of that panel discussion. I mean, it's almost as if the Biden administration must be working for the Kremlin, Arnaud, because they're absolutely validating everything that the Kremlin's saying. Your thoughts?
Yes, indeed. It's a two-pronged, actually, analysis. The first one, as Scott says, is trying to massage the perception over the reality. And the second one is to justify all those military budgets. Because let's make no mistake about it, it's all about feeding the beast, feeding the blob. And all it takes, really, despite all the means and resources that those people marshal, all it takes is one screw up like this one to unravel the entire operation. It's a fiasco, let's be honest here. And so, what will people remember from this particular aspect of the panels at the Speech 2024 is the Scot Ritter incident.
Yes.
Just like,
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Somehow.
Fun fact, Scott, after the St. Petersburg conference, had a film crew ready to go and had already gone through pre-production for a documentary series that would have spanned the length and breadth of Russia, of the Russian, continental Russia, from the Baltic to the Pacific. And his idea behind this documentary is to foster understanding between the East and West, to sort of show the human side and the full picture of what the Russian Federation is and is about. And so I think that's an admirable project from myself, from a filmmaker's point of view or a journalistic point of view. I think this is an admirable undertaking. Many have done this before, Arnaud, but the U.S. government, I think this documentary, they got the sense that this is potentially damaging to the anti-Russian narrative. And Scott Ritter being the vehicle for this, I think they felt that if they could stop Scott, that they're going to stop this message from getting through. That's my personal interpretation of what happened, knowing about this documentary project, which doesn't get talked about as much. Scott's mentioned it a few times already. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, in this hybrid warfare context, this is par for the course as far as what we could expect to promote, Russia. Russia is not just obviously, the urban centers. It's an immense land, 1/6 of the world landmass, very diverse, and quite unknown to Western audiences. And so this idea of doing a kind of a Route 66, Eastern version sounds like it could be a seminal event in the battle of ideas. And there are also a lot of issues bearing on tourism and exploring, the possibility of investment, i.e., getting people to maybe retrieve their investment from one place and put it into another. So, but again, it all comes back to what we were saying, is that either those people are incompetent, or they somehow still believe that they lived 30 years ago, like in a place that was 30 years ago in their mind. It's almost like an echo chamber. But the more they try to extricate themselves from the quicksand, the more the quicksand draws them in.
Yeah, the louder they shout, Putin's a dictator. Putin's a dictator. Yeah. And then what do they do? The biggest dictator.
I've known him for 40 years.
Literally refusenik treatment for an American. I mean, unbelievable.
Yes, it's all absurd. I mean, if the stakes weren't so high in terms of, and I guess maybe we'll get the chance to discuss this later on, but it would be like almost a comedy. I mean, it's funny. But no, it is reality. And this actually brings the question about the competence of the people who run Western countries. And that opens up a whole kind of worms in terms of analysis, because those are complex processes and require people who can really reflect and take decisions, while taking into account a whole range of factors. You don't want to rush into things. You don't want to have a Pavlovian reaction to just because you hear the term Russia, for instance. I mean, there's 1,001 way to, I was going to say, if I put myself in their shoes, sell the idea that the blob requires those resources, but you can do it in a way that's more subtle. But here it's almost like a cartoon. It's like a Tex Avery cartoon, where's the wolf, who runs over the precipice, and before he actually realizes that there's no ground beneath his feet, he for a while, runs on empty.
Yeah.
So
the Wile E. Coyote effect. Yeah.
Wile E. Coyote. Yeah.
Yeah. Arnaud, we were talking about Scott Ritter's refusenik treatment by the U.S. State Department. Effectively, we can say by the Biden administration, because that's who's in charge. This is their sort of way of handling the hybrid warfare you're talking about, by basically trying to physically silence voices. Of course, the futility of that is pretty obvious, that he became more of an attraction. I mean, this really helped the ratings of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, huge numbers watching the live stream globally, just because of the fact that they knew Scott Ritter was going to be talking, even remotely, from upper state New York or wherever he was. We have another clip here. This is the part 2 clip that we chose. And what I like about this is Scott's talking about the quality. You just mentioned this before the break, Arnaud. You're talking about the competency of people in the U.S. government and their inability to react appropriately to some of these situations, or just to have a general grasp and understanding of the situation that they're in. Right now, we're talking about this void of diplomacy and the escalation ladder as well, and how dangerous that is over Ukraine. And everyone's talking about it right now. Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, dedicated quite a lot of comment time to this issue. Here's Scott Ritter giving his perspective. I think this is a really valuable perspective. This is why we've chosen this clip. Let's go ahead and roll this. I want to get your reaction, Arnaud, to this particular passage from the event. Let's go ahead and listen to this.
Not only a former UN weapons inspector, but you also served on the US Marine Corps and you were an intelligence officer there. So once upon a time, there was an appreciation of expertise in the United States, analysis, intelligence, all that kind of stuff. And ultimately, you can argue that this is what allowed the United States to become one of the world's greatest powers, so rich, so powerful, so intellectually vibrant. What happened to all of that? Because, people of your generation, at least those of them left within the administration or Washington think tanks, I don't believe they can believe that Russia can be treated in such a way it is being treated, or China, or any other country for that matter, can be treated the way the United States allows itself to treat other countries.
Well, that's an outstanding point. I grew up as a child of the Cold War, and that was an existential struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. At that time, our military had a class of officers known as Soviet Foreign Area Officers. These were military professionals, many of whom had combat experience in Vietnam, who were trained in Russian history, Russian language, Russian culture. And then they were given the task of explaining the Soviet Union, Russia, to leadership so that the leadership could better understand how the adversary was thinking. At this point of view, required absolute assiduous adherence to fact, the truth. This wasn't propaganda. Our job was to, tell our bosses what the reality of the situation was. And I am proud to count myself among this elite group of people. I studied Russian history. I served in the former Soviet Union as a weapons inspector, implementing the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. As I tell my Russian friends and colleagues today, I was trained to kill Russians. I wasn't trained to love Russians. I wasn't trained to embrace Russians. I was trained to kill Russians.
But in order to kill, you need to respect them and know them.
I know my enemy as myself. The ambassador, the United States ambassador to the Soviet Union at the time that I served in the Soviet Union was Jack Matlock. This was a man of great culture. He represented the United States very well, but I remember working with him when he was to come visit us. And our Soviet counterpart said, what do we show the ambassador when he comes to Udmurtia, to Votkинsk, where he had never been before? And I asked the ambassador's staff, and the response was, show me Udmurtia, show me the people, show me the soul. I want to learn about this. This is an approach taken by the ambassador of the United States at a time when we were still adversaries. You compare and contrast that with Michael McFaul, who was the ambassador of the United States to Russia under President Obama. A man who doesn't care about Russian history, doesn't care about the Russian soul, only cares about how the United States can dominate and exploit. The Foreign Area Officer class that I was proud to be a part of when the Cold War ended was disbanded. And it hasn't been replaced with people with the same mindset. It's been replaced with diplomats and soldiers who are trained not to learn about your enemy, but to despise your enemy, to hate your enemy. We don't want to learn about Russian culture. We belittle Russian culture. And this is the difference. And you can't, again, let's just speak from the perspective of potential adversaries. If we want to, quote unquote, defeat Russia and we don't know Russia, it's a guarantee that we will suffer defeat. We need to, and again, I'm somebody who doesn't believe anymore about killing Russia. I want to be friends with Russia. I believe that the proper course of action is to learn more about Russia and bring it home to America. But again, we come down to what I talked about at the beginning, perception versus reality. And right now, the enemies of Russia want to create a perception that's so far removed from reality. And it's essential that all of us work together to explain the Russian soul to the American people so that we can avoid the conflict.
Okay, interesting perspective there. Arnaud, your thoughts?
Well, I would say through 2 points with a addendum. First is when the Cold War ended, what a lot of people don't know is that former adversaries, i.e. in this case CIA and KGB guys, they would get together over whiskey or whatever, vodka, and reminisce about the good old days. There was not this hatred, that you see today. They were just doing their job respectively, and everybody understood that. And so there was a sense of somewhat respect between erstwhile adversaries. You're not in it for personal reasons. You're just basically doing your job. Then my first point is that yes, and Scott alluded to this. There was those people, his generation, I guess my generation, I'm about the same age. We're the last generation before internet, right? So we all received somewhat of a classical education, kind of a well-rounded one, where you need to come and grasp any kind of problem coming from a well-rounded approach. Need to have as much of multi-spectrum understanding of what's going on, as opposed to somewhat. And this is what we see today with the emphasis on hyper-technicity, hyper-specialization. Everyone can tell you how to do a very specific, minute, and timely operation on whatever mechanical work. But once you zoom out, they're completely panicked about, how this fit in the larger context, The second point is, let me see. I forgot. That's it. I have a whole other.
Just on that point, yes. Just on that point, Arnaud, let me interject. Most of these people from this generation, I know that they either studied in Europe, studied in Russia, at periods of time, very good understanding of Russian language, culture. Ray McGovern's a good example of this. Absolute appreciation for the history and everything else. I know my first time in Europe, there was no internet. I just had a little paperback book called Let's Go Europe. And that was like my guide. I had to figure everything out on the ground with absolutely no information. And I think, a lot of these people who are in these diplomatic positions previously, they had some similar experiences when they were younger. So that sort of, ability to kind of, to survey the culture, survey society, read the room, as it were. They're very good at that. Nowadays, I don't see that same skill set, unfortunately. And I think that speaks to, a lot of the problems. And I would just say, quite frankly, the lack of respect in many cases of other countries. It's almost like we're more powerful than you. We have a better military on paper, therefore you should sit down and listen to us and shut up, basically. That's the attitude I get from Washington when you hear John Kirby and these other spokespeople talk. It's very dismissive. It's just like, well, that's what the Russians say. And, why should we listen to them? It's Putin. And they're all literally, they frog march people to the ballot boxes at gunpoint in Russia. That's what they tell each other in America. Not true at all. So, I mean, that's the thing that I think is preventing. Scott talked about it, Arnaud. He said, it's the reality versus the propaganda. And before, it was your job to know the reality. But now, in the current United States and Europe, it's your job to adhere to the propaganda. And so if policy emanates from your perspective of either reality or propaganda based, then your policy is going to reflect that perspective. And so much of European and Western policy reflects propaganda. So we're marinated in our own propaganda. This is why the policies are not working. That's I think, something that is very difficult for some people who are at close range to grasp. We have a safe enough distance to look at this and see the bigger picture. We can see that this is the case. But I think, Arnaud, if you're in the halls of power right now in the West, I don't think you can see this. Your final thoughts. I'll give you the floor, Arnaud. Go ahead.
Yes, actually, that was my second point, is that this is actually reminiscent of the final stage of the ex-Soviet Union. I mean, everything was completely out of a Kafka book. And, we call the Potemkin village and all those things, which were, everybody goes along, but everybody knows that the gig is up, including the people who lived back in those days under the Soviet rule. But you made a good point. Gone are the days of the Brent Scowcroft, the Jim Becker III. You mentioned Jack Matlock. There's also a former ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Freeman. Brilliant.
Yeah, Chaz Freeman. Yeah,
Chaz Freeman. Yep. Yes. So and you see, how far we've fallen in a sense in terms of quality personnel. And you mentioned it. I mean, it does not bode well for someone to have somewhat novel ideas from deviating from the narrative today. Everybody is concerned about their mortgage. It's a government job. It's a federal gig. It pays well as long as you toe the line. You'll make a good career and be preserved from the inflation that your own government is artificially creating on the rest of the population. And so it becomes this kind of, last one behind me. This is kind of a rope, in the rock climbing. Everybody keeps cutting the rope from underneath them, and everybody else falls, and they hope that somehow it will preserve, the concept, the entire construct. But it never does. It's you have to somehow, understand that if you undermine your own principle, your own base, you're left with nothing to stand on. And the same thing goes on in Europe. We can see it at the EU Commission as well. It's completely absurd. I mean, it's a theater of the absurd. We saw it with von der Leyen this week again. And there was a meme, actually, interesting meme, where, all she has to offer for a second term is to build shelters. Anticipation of what? I mean, Europe was supposed to be about prosperity and peace. And all we got instead was austerity and war. If
and
going
underground, you can bunker up. I've got an image on that point, Arnaud. Let's bring this image up on screen. This is Sweden. This is a flyer one of our people on the ground sent us from Scandinavia. These are 17 U.S. bases that are now being opened in Sweden after they've joined NATO. I mean, look at that. And part of that is they have huge Cold War bunkers in Sweden. Von der Leyen was in Finland recently showing off the bunkers. They've got huge facilities they're starting to revamp in Sweden in preparation for some kind of a nuclear exchange. Look at all those U.S. bases. That's sovereign U.S. territory, by the way. They have their own laws, their own sort of courts and whatnot on each of those bases, Arnaud. So that's the recolonization of Europe. That's the way many Swedish opposition people are now looking at this. And look at that. Look at Finland, Norway as well. We're seeing this U.S. takeover of Scandinavia, militarizing it in preparation for some major confrontation with Russia. I don't think the people of Europe want to see that. Russia doesn't want to see that. I don't know anyone who does, other than Zelensky maybe, and a couple of other sort of insane people bunkered up in Kiev. But Washington's got no problem taking Europe down this road. Ursula von der Leyen herself has no problem dragging Europe, dragging them, whichever the case may be, into some kind of a permanent war footing or war situation. I mean, this is completely like antithetical to everything that Europe was post World War II, Arnaud, as you said. And I don't know. Look, we just got a minute left. I mean, did you have a chance to see the Hunter Biden trial at all, or to catch any? You're vindicated, and everyone else who said this laptop was genuine. We have the receipts now. FBI agent takes a stand. Laptop was not tampered with. Yes, it's not Russian disinformation. It's not propaganda. It's all real. And by the way, we've got a copy of all those emails here in the Marco Polo report. So, just saying, they're all there. You can actually get that book. Just go to Marco Polo 501c3 on X Twitter or their website and get it. But we'll bring your book up on stage. Arnaud Develay, again, author of Foreign Entanglements. This book is available right now on Amazon, I think on Barnes & Noble as well. And so a lot more people are getting a hold of this. This has got all the information of what's really happening right now behind the scenes. So all the Ukraine stuff has kind of been outed with this Hunter Biden trial, Arnaud. So, for yourself and many other researchers and authors, very much vindicated that what you and others have been saying all along is absolutely the case. Now we have the receipts after this Hunter Biden trial. Totally backfired, this trial on the Bidens, but pretty incredible scene coming out of Wilmington, Delaware. Don't you think, Arnaud?
Yes, and actually this is all the second part of my book, which is the weaponization of the Justice Department. And make no mistake about it, Jill Biden, presence on day one of Hunter's trial, basically is somewhat of a veiled injunction to, make sure that they get the right results. So that's it. The circle is closed. They don't even try to hide it now. They basically are covering their steps, using all the institutional means to do it. Sometimes when that's not enough, they'll send some kind of not so subtle messages. It's a mafia. They're running. It's a family, basically a mafia family, who's running the federal government as if it's their own private property. That's unfortunately where we are now.
I remember when they said Nancy Reagan was running the White House, when Ronald was a little bit shaky, and there was speculation to that effect. I think there's no doubt that Joe Biden is running the Oval Office, because Joe certainly is not in charge of his faculties. I think we saw that at the D-Day celebrations, Arnaud. So that whole saga is going to continue to go more toxic as each week and month goes by. I don't know how they're going to keep Biden. Compos Mentis for the Democratic convention, he's probably not even going to show up. I heard they're going to nominate him by Zoom. So anyway, not kidding. That's not a joke. That's actually true. Arnaud Develay, author of Foreign Entanglements. Again, thank you for joining us on TNT this week.
Thank you, Patrick. Always a pleasure.
There he goes, folks. Please pick up that book, especially during this election season. You will be armed and ready to go. He's got all the receipts in Foreign Entanglements. Great book. Great segment as well. First hour, Peter Ford, former British ambassador to Syria. Author Arnaud Develay. It's been great to have you guys this week. We'll see you on Monday, same time, same place. Have a